Hello. Welcome to this year's Cornwall Reads Cornwall. I'm going to take a quick moment to ask you to silence your cell phones if you don't mind. I'm Kerry, Donahue, and I'm absolutely delighted to be your host this afternoon. This is the 5th year we've gathered for this literary tradition, a celebration of what makes our corner of the world honestly just lousy with talented writers. But this year we're going a little farther afield, to writers with deep connections to another Cornwall, Cornwall, England. Now, you're wondering, our name does come from that Cornwall, but as far as anyone can tell, there is no historic or geographic connection between here and there. When the original 6 parcels of land in this area were transferred, 3 were named after biblical sites, Canaan, Sharon, and Goshen, and 3 after English counties, Kent, Norfolk, and Cornwall. Still, it appears that it is hard not to speculate. The Cornwall, Connecticut historian Timothy Stone may have been stretching a bit when he said the name may have come from a resemblance to the county of Cornwall, England, which he described as remarkable for its rough surface and rude mountains, and more especially for its mines and mineral wealth. You have to remember that when Cornwall was incorporated, our Cornwall was incorporated in 1740, people thought there was actual gold in Cream Hill, not just our beloved golds. So backing up for a moment, for those of you who might need a quick geography lesson about where Cornwall, England is, in your mind's eye, picture a map of Britain. Now shift your gaze to the lower left corner, to the very southwest part of the country. There's a long peninsula that juts out into the Celtic Sea just below Wales. That's Cornwall. The southern coast marks the entrance to the English Channel. That Cornwall, like ours, is notable for its striking natural beauty. Theirs is more of the seaside surfing and stunning cliffs kind of charms. But this afternoon, as we transport you to the Cornwall with 4 of its best known writers, I wanted to offer just a few dad facts about that Cornwall to help transport you there. So Cornwall, England was originally settled by the Celts. To this day, the residents feel a bit apart. In fact, there's a centuries-old saying that goes, "A Cornishman is a Cornishman first, and an Englishman reluctantly." Cornwall, England had its own language. It's a bit like Welsh, and it was extinct by the late 18th or early 19th century. There is a revival movement, however. Cornish tin was critical to the Bronze Age, and for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, Cornwall, England was considered the mining center of the world. And related to that, just a little bit of gastronomic information. You may be familiar with Cornish pasties, those pastry crust-filled, delicious meat and veg things. Cornwall's world-renowned miners brought them for lunch, and the outside crust kept the meat inside safe from hazardous dust. So, and in case you're noticing at this point that Cornwallians there call themselves Cornish. So we make a modest proposal today that we might consider doing the same. Just imagine the original Cornish farmers market, the Cornish package store, the Cornish Chronicle, like just a thought. So, 2 other minor connections to Cornwall. Cornwall, England has its own flag, as you can see here. The flag of St. Piran. He was a patron saint of miners, and it is a plain white cross on a black background. We have our own flag too. Ours is newer, of course, and it's more colorful. It has a little bit of everything from our covered bridge to Mohawk Mountain, and is all in the shape of a cow. So, but still, like, we have our own flags. There's another very minor connection that turns out to be me. My mother reminded me over Thanksgiving dinner that my maternal great-grandfather, Thomas Cottle, came from Cornwall, England, and settled in Cleveland, Ohio when he was 14. When I asked ChatGPT to help me write an intro comparing the literary legacies to Cornwall and Cornwall, it spat out the following. These 2 Cornwalls share an ineffable bond, a legacy of fostering literary brilliance. They stand as bastions of inspiration, inviting writers to draw from the essence of their surroundings and breathe life into their words. So, perhaps a little over the top, but I agree, ChatGPT. And as our co-organizer Roxana suggests, Perhaps the most significant link between the Cornwalls is a psychological one, a link between wildness and creativity, between summer houses and childhood memories that lead to full-time residence, and creative work between solitude and inspiration. So let us begin with this year's Cornwall Reads Cornwall. And a quick note, we are having a reception at the library following this, and we hope you will join us. Our first reading will be by Jonathan Arnold, who will read 3 poems from the famously witty John Betjeman. Jonathan will introduce you to Betjeman, and I will tell you a little bit about Jonathan. Jonathan Arnold was born and raised in Texas, but he says he escaped to the East Coast to study English literature at Amherst College, and he never looked back. He and his partner, Stephen Soba, first came to Cornwall as renters 15 years ago, and they purchased a house on Pierce Lane in 2020. When he is not drawing for the Cornish Chronicle and the Rose Allgrant Show, Jonathan teaches algebra at Indian Mountain School in Lakeville. He says careful listeners may detect the remains of his Texas accent in spite of his efforts to erase it entirely. Welcome, Jonathan Arnold.
Of the 4 writers being read this afternoon, John Betjeman's name may ring the fewest bells for an American audience, yet in the UK he was one of the most popular poets of the late 20th century. He was Britain's poet laureate from 1972 until his death in 1984, and he even became a television celebrity. Born in 1906, a year before W.H. Auden, Betjeman was a young student of T.S. Eliot. His work, however, is considered anti-modernist. He was out of step with the movement toward the experimental in academic circles, preferring instead to focus on traditional metrical structures and rhymes, often using more everyday language that reached a wider audience. Betjeman's more accessible style belies the real seriousness of his work, which can take a person by surprise. After Oxford, Betjeman worked as a private secretary, as a school teacher, and as a film critic for the Evening Standard, where he also wrote a society gossip column called Londoners' Diary. He also worked for the magazine Architectural Review for 5 years as a full-time assistant editor, and his passion for Victorian architecture helped save St. Pancras Station, among other landmarks. One delightful detail for all of you Brideshead Revisited fans: while at Oxford, Betjeman carried around a teddy bear named Archibald, thereby inspiring his contemporary Evelyn Waugh to give his character Sebastian Flyte a teddy bear named Aloysius. Betjeman knew Cornwall, England from childhood on, and he chose to be buried in a churchyard there, so you can find him there. The first 2 poems I will read are rather self-explanatory. The first is a poem about Cornwall, and then a poem about tennis and romance. And I'll say a bit about the 3rd poem before I begin it. Cornish Cliffs. Those moments, tasted once and never done, of long surf breaking in the midday sun, a far-off blowhole booming like a gun. The seagulls plane and circle out of sight, below this thirsty, thrift-encrusted height. The veined sea campion buds burst into white. And gorse turns tawny orange, seen beside pale drifts of primroses cascading wide to where the slate falls sheer into the tide. More than in gardened Surrey, nature spills a wealth of heather, kidney vetch, and squills over these long-defended Cornish hills. A gun emplacement of the latest war looks older than the hill fort built before Saxon or Norman headed for the shore. And in the shadowless, unclouded glare, deep blue above us fades to whiteness, where a misty sea line meets the wash of air. Nut smell of gorse and honey smell of ling waft out to sea the freshness of the spring, on sunny shallows, green and whispering. The wideness which the the lark song gives the sky, shrinks at the clang of seabirds sailing by, whose notes are tuned to days when seas are high. From today's calm, the lane's enclosing green leads inland to a usual Cornish scene, slate cottages with sycamore between. Small fields and telemasts and wires and poles with, as the everlasting ocean rolls, 2 chapels built for 100 souls. A subaltern's love song. Miss J. Hunter Dunn, Miss J. Hunter Dunn, furnished and burnished by Aldershot's sun. What strenuous singles we played after tea, we in the tournament, you against me. Love 30, love 40, oh, weakness of joy, the speed of the swallow, the grace of a boy. With carefulest carelessness, gaily you won. I am weak from your loveliness, Joan Hunter Dunn. Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, how mad I am, sad I am, glad that you won. The warm-handled racket is back in its press, but my shock-headed victor, she loves me no less. Her father's euonymus shines as we walk and swing past the summer house buried in talc and cool the veranda that welcomes us in to the 6 o'clock news and a lime juice and gin. The scent of the conifers, sound of the bath, the view from my bedroom of moss-dappled path as I struggle with double-end evening tie, for we dance at the golf club, my Victor and I. On the floor of her bedroom lie blazer and shorts, and the cream-colored walls are betrothed with sports. And westering, questioning settles the sun on your low-leaded window, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn. The Hillman is waiting, the lights in the hall, the pictures of Egypt are bright on the wall. My sweet, I am standing beside the oak stair, and there, on the landings, the light on your hair. By roads not adopted, by woodlanded ways, she drove to the club in the late summer haze, into 9 o'clock Camberley, heavy with bells and mushroomy, pine-woody, evergreen smells. Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, I can hear from the car park, the dance has begun. Oh, full Surrey twilight, importunate band. Oh, strongly adorable tennis girl's hand. Around us are Rovers and Austins afar. Above us, the intimate roof of the car. And here on my right is the girl of my choice, with the tilt of her nose and the chime of her voice, and the scent of her wrap, and the words never said, and the ominous, ominous dancing ahead. We sat in the car park till 20 to 1, and now I'm engaged to Miss Joan Hunter Dunn. All right, the last poem for me is The Arrest of Oscar Wilde at the Cadogan Hotel, and it may need a bit more context. You may remember that the playwright Oscar Wilde sued his lover's father for libel, and after he lost that case, he was countersued for being a homosexual, which it turns out was fairly easy to prove. Encouraged by his friends to leave for France to avoid imprisonment, Wilde refused. He was arrested at the Cadogan Hotel in London in 1895 and served 2 years hard labor, after which he was really broken. He died in 1900 at the age of 46. The poem imagines his last few free moments in room 118, anticipating the police who arrive in plain clothes out of respect for the hotel's reputation. Wilde's friend is Robbie Ross, an erstwhile competitor for Wilde's affections. There is a reference to a yellow book, which was a literary journal. In Betjeman's poem, Wilde bemoans the journal's inclusion of an established and conventional poet by the name of John Buchan. Betjeman wrote this imagining in 1933, almost 40 years after Wilde's arrest, and some say that the then 30-year-old poet was saying something about his own career and also about his sympathies toward homosexuals. The arrest of Oscar Wilde at the Cadogan Hotel. He sipped at a weak hock and seltzer as he gazed at the London skies through the Nottingham lace of the curtains, or was it his bees-winged eyes? To the right and before him, Pont Street did tower in her new-built red, as hard as the morning gaslight that shone on his unmade bed. I want some more hock in my seltzer, and Robbie, please give me your hand. Is this the end or the beginning? How can I understand? So you've brought me the latest yellow book, and Buchan has got in it now. Approval of what is approved of is as false as a well-kept vow. More hock, Robbie. Where's the seltzer? Dear boy, pull again at the bell. They are all little better than cretins, though this is the Cadogan Hotel. One Astrakhan coat is at Willis's, another one's at the Savoy. Do fetch my Morocco portmanteau and bring them on later, dear boy. A thump and a murmur of voices. Oh, why must they make such a din? As the door of the bedroom swung open and two plainclothes policemen came in. Mr. Wilde, we have come for to take you, where felons and criminals dwell. We must ask you to leave with us quietly, for this is the Cadogan Hotel. He rose, and he put down the yellow book. He staggered, and terrible-eyed, he brushed past the palms on the staircase and was helped to a hansom outside.
Our second reader this afternoon is one of the co-organizers of this event and the only actual Brit involved, Jane Garmey. She will read passages by Daphne du Maurier. Jane Garmey grew up in England, though not in Cornwall, and she's lived here in this Cornwall since 1995. She's a former public television and audiobook producer who now writes about gardens. In fact, she was for several years the gardening correspondent for Town and Country. She is also the author of Great British Baking, A Well-Kept Secret, and a longtime champion of British food before it was cool. Here in Cornwall, she's on the boards of the Cornwall Library and the Belasco Foundation. She gardens non-competitively, plays tennis somewhat competitively, and bridge very competitively. Welcome, Jane Garmey.
Daphne du Maurier was born in 1907 and she died in 1989. She was a novelist and a playwright, and her work actually was not terribly well received when she was alive. She was often categorized as a romantic novelist, a term that she deplored since her novels really have happy endings and often have sinister overtones. She spent her early childhood in Hampstead, but in 1926, her family bought a house in Bodmin on the west coast of Cornwall, a place that gave du Maurier the freedom I desired, long sought for, not yet known, freedom to write, to walk, to wander, freedom to climb the hills and be alone. Climbing those hills one day, du Maurier discovered Menabilly, an abandoned wreck of a house almost engulfed by overgrown creeper. She was captivated and entranced by its grandeur, its shabbiness, and its disrepair. It became the inspiration for Manderley, the house in her most famous novel, Rebecca. After years of trying, she eventually persuaded the owners of Menabille to let her rent it, and she moved there with her family in 1943 and continued to live there and in Cornwall for the next 26 years. However, in 1967, she was forced to leave after years of trying to fight to retain her lease, which she didn't succeed in, and Menabille was as lost to her as if it had been swallowed in a fire. Maurier wrote Rebecca in 1937 when she was living in Egypt. She was married to the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, and by now was the mother of 2 children. She was unhappy, shy, and spent most of her time in Egypt writing Rebecca. It became her best-known novel and has never gone out of print since it was published in 1938. It sold millions of copies and was made into a hugely successful film starring Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. Its famous opening lines set the scene for a novel about secrets, obsessions, and dreams that become nightmares. Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive, and for a while I could not enter, for the way was barred. There was a padlock and a chain upon the gate, and peering closer through the rusted spokes of the gate, I saw that the lodge was uninhabited. No smoke came from the chimney. Then, like all dreamers, I was possessed with supernatural powers and passed like a spirit through the barrier. The drive wound away in front of me, twisting and turning as it had almost done. But now I was aware that it was narrowed and unkempt, not the drive we had known. Nature had come into her own again, and little by little, in her stealthy, insidious way, had encroached upon the drive with long, tenacious fingers. On and on wound the poor thread that had once been our drive. I had not thought the way so long. I came upon the house quite suddenly, and as I stood, my heart thumping in my breast, the strange prick of tears behind my eyes, there was Manderley, our Manderley, secret and silent as it had always been, the grey stones shining in the moonlight of my dream. Time could not wreck the perfect symmetry of those walls, nor the site itself a jewel in the hollow of a hand. Rebecca's written in the first person from the perspective of a young, unnamed narrator who, while working as a lady's companion in Monte Carlo, meets the dashing yet unhappy widower, Max de Winter, we often called Maxine. She is anxious, observant, dreamy, romantic, and her fears and insecurities multiply when she marries him and becomes mistress of Manderley. She soon learns that Rebecca, Maxime's first wife, who died drowning in a storm, was everything that she isn't. Talented, accomplished, a brilliant hostess, and beyond beautiful. Manderley was her domain, and our narrator is both fascinated and repelled by her predecessor. One day she cannot resist going into what had been Rebecca's bedroom, now kept shut and never used, and situated in another wing of the house. Suddenly, the door opens, and Mrs. Danvers, the sinister, malevolent housekeeper who had adored Rebecca and has never hidden her scorn and dislike of the new Mrs. De Winter, appears. "Are you feeling unwell?" she said, coming near me, speaking very softly. I backed away. I believe if she'd come any closer, I should have fainted. I felt her breath on my face. "I'm all right, Mrs. Danvers," I said. I just did not expect to see you. The fact is, I was looking up at the windows from the lawn. I noticed one of the shutters was not quite closed, so I came up to see if I could fasten it." Mrs. Danvers came and stood beside me. She smiled, and her manner, instead of being still and unbending as it usually was, became startlingly familiar, fawning even. "Why didn't you tell me the shutter was open?" she asked. "You opened it yourself, didn't you now? You wanted to see the room." Why have you never asked me to show it to you before? You had only to ask me. I wanted to run away, but I could not move. I went on watching her eyes. Now you're here, let me show you everything, she said, her voice ingratiatingly and sweet as honey, horrible, false. I know you want to see it all. You've wanted to see it for a long time. It's a lovely room, isn't it? The loveliest room you've ever seen. She took hold of my arm and walked me towards the bed. The touch of her hand made me shudder, and her voice was low and intimate, a voice I hated and feared. That was her bed. It's a beautiful bed, isn't it? I keep the golden coverlet on it always. It was her favourite. Here is her nightdress inside the case. You've been touching it, haven't you? Wouldn't you like to touch it again? Feel it, hold it. Look, this is her dressing gown. These are her slippers. She forced the slippers over my hands, smiling all the while. You've seen her brushes, haven't you? She said, taking me to the dressing table. They are just as she used them. I used to brush her hair for her every evening for 20 minutes at a time. It came down below her waist. And when she was first married, Mr. De Winter used to brush it for her. He was always gay and laughing then. She went on, looking at me and watching my eyes. Sometimes I wonder, she whispered, sometimes I wonder if Rebecca comes back here to Manderley and watches you and Mr. De Winter together. We stood there by the door. I could not take my eyes away from hers. How sombre they were, the white skull face of hers, how malevolent and how full of hatred. Some months later, it is decided to hold a grand fancy dress ball at Manderley, which will be the first one to be held since Rebecca's death. Mrs. Danvers suggests to our narrator that for her costume, she copy one of the pictures in the gallery, which is a portrait by Rayburn of Caroline de Winter, the sister of Maxime's great-grandfather. Our narrator loves the idea and has the costume copied exactly, utterly failing to understand what motives Mrs. Danvers might have in suggesting such a costume to her. She is going to keep it, she keeps it a secret from her husband, and she has absolutely no idea that Rebecca had worn the identical outfit at the last great fancy dress ball to be held at Manderley before she died. On the night of the ball, here's it. I came forward to the head of the stairs and stood smiling, my hat in my hand, like the girl in the picture. I waited for the clapping and laughter that would follow as I walked slowly down the stairs. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. How do you do, Mr. De Winter, I said. Maxime had not moved. He stared up at me. There was no colour in his face. It was ashen white. I hesitated. Something was wrong. Why was he looking like that? Why did they all stand like that, like people in a trance? And Maxime moved towards the stairs, his eyes never leaving my face. What the hell do you think you're doing? He asked. His eyes blazed in anger, his face still ashen. I could not move. I went on standing there, my hand on the banister. It's the picture, I said, terrified at his eyes, at his voice. It's the picture, the one in the gallery of Caroline de Winter. There was a long silence. We went on staring at each other. Nobody moved. I swallowed. What is it? I said. What have I done? If only they would not stare at me like that with dull, blank faces. If only someone would say something. When Maxime spoke again, I did not recognize his voice. It was still and quiet, icy cold, a voice that I did not know. Go and change, he said. It does not matter what you put on. Anything will do. Go now before anybody else comes. I could not speak. I went on staring. His eyes were the only living things in that white mask of his face. What are you standing there for? He said, his voice harsh and clear. Didn't you hear what I said? I turned and ran blindly through the archway. Tears blinded my eyes. The corridor was deserted. Then I saw that the door leading to the west wing was wide open and that someone was standing there. It was Mrs. Danvers. I shall never forget the expression on her face. Loathsome, triumphant. She stood there smiling at me.
Thank you, Jane. Our next reader this afternoon is Duncan Webb, who will read a terrific and surprisingly prescient passage from famous spy novelist John le Carre. Let me first tell you a little bit about Duncan Webb. He was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and moved to New York City in 1989 to pursue a career as a management consultant in the cultural sector. He and his wife Stefana first started coming to this area in the early 90s with friends and family, and he purchased a home on Cream Hill Road in 2003. Duncan is currently active in Cornwall as a member of the Friends of the North Cornwall Meeting House Committee, a trustee of the UCC Church, a member of the Cornwall Economic Development Commission, and an occasional helper at the food pantry. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you. It is an honor to be able to stand here today to join in this great event. And I get to read John le Carre. That was the pen name for David John Moore Cornwall. The novelist and former intelligence officer was a resident of St. Buryan near Penzance for nearly 40 years, living and writing there until his death. In 2010, le Carre rhapsodized about Cornwall. It seems that I can think well here. I can populate the empty landscape with my imagination. John le Carre's best-known character is George Smiley, whom le Carre saw as an intentional foil to James Bond, a character he believed depicted espionage in an inaccurate and damaging way. Short, overweight, balding, bespectacled, polite, and self-effacing, Smiley's age seems to be permanently 60 years old. He frequently allows others to mistreat him, including his serially unfaithful wife, who describes him as breathtakingly ordinary. Another colleague considers him the most forgettable man she had ever met. These traits mask his inner cunning, excellent memory, and occasional recklessness. The world of espionage presented by le Carre is a world where lies, betrayal, intrigue, and paranoia are the norm for both sides, and much of Smiley's appeal, the central character in 9 of his novels, is that of a moral man trying his best to stay decent in a profoundly amoral world. The following excerpt is taken from The Secret Pilgrim, published in 1990, 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Here, George Smiley is speaking to his British Secret Service colleagues on the occasion of his retirement. "So, it's over," said Smiley. The glow of the dying fire lit the paneled library, gilding its gappy shelves of dusty books on travel and adventure, and the old cracked leather of its armchairs, and the foxed photographs of its vanished battalions of uniformed officers with walking sticks. And finally, our own assorted faces turned to Smiley on his throne of honor. 4 generations of the service lounged about the room, but Smiley's quiet voice and the haze of cigar smoke seemed to bind us in a single family. "It's over," Smiley repeated. Was it his sudden stillness that alerted us, his altered voice, or almost some priestly gesture that he made, a stiffening of his tubby body in piety or resolution? I couldn't have told you then, I can't tell you now. But I know I caught no one's eye, yet with his words, I felt at once a kind of tensing among us, as if Smiley were calling us to arms. Yet what he was talking about had as much to do with laying them down as taking them up. "It's over, and so am I. Absolutely over. Time you rang down the curtain on yesterday's Cold Warrior. And please don't ask me back ever again. The new time needs new people. The worst thing you can do is imitate us." I think he had intended to end there, but with George, you do better not to guess. For all I know, he had committed his entire closing speech to memory before he came, worked on it, rehearsed it word for word. In either case, our silence now commanded him, as did our need of ceremony. Indeed, so thorough was our dependence on him at that moment, that if he had turned and walked from the room without offering us another word, our disappointment would have turned our love to gold. I only ever cared about the man, Smiley announced, and it was typical of his artfulness that he should have opened with a riddle, then waited a moment before setting out to explain it. I never gave a fig for the ideologies unless they were mad or evil. I never saw institutions as being worthy of their parts or policies as being much other than excuses for not viewing. Man, not the mass, is what our calling is about. It was man who ended the Cold War, in case you didn't notice. It wasn't weaponry or technology or armies or campaigns. It was just man. Not even Western man either, as it happens, but our sworn enemy in the East, who went into the streets, faced the bullets and the batons, and said, "We've had enough." It was their emperor, not ours, who had the nerve to mount the rostrum and declare he had no clothes. And the ideologies trailed after these impossible events like condemned prisoners, as ideologies do when they've had their day. Because they have no heart of their own. They are the horrors and angels of our striving selves. One day, history may tell us who really won. If a democratic Russia emerges, why then Russia will have been the winner. And if the West chokes on its materialism, then the West may still turn out to have been the loser. History keeps her secrets longer than most of us, but she has one secret that I will reveal to you tonight in the greatest confidence. Sometimes there are no winners at all, and sometimes nobody needs to lose. You ask me how we should think of Russia today. You ask, he went on, can we ever trust the bear? You seem to be amused, yet a bit unseated by the notion that we can talk to the Russians like human beings and find common cause with them in many fields. I will give you several answers at once. The first is no, we can never trust the bear. For one reason, the bear doesn't trust himself. The bear is threatened, and the bear is frightened, and the bear is falling apart. The bear is disgusted with his past, sick of his present, and scared stiff of his future. He often was. The bear is broke, lazy, volatile, incompetent, slippery, dangerously proud, dangerously armed, sometimes brilliant, often ignorant. Without its claws, he'd be just another chaotic member of the third world. But he isn't without his claws, not by any means. And he can't pull his soldiers back from foreign parts overnight for the good reason that he can't house them or feed them or employ them, and he doesn't trust them either. And since this service is the hired keeper of our national mistrust, we'd be neglecting our duty if we relaxed for 1 second our watch on the bear or on any of his unruly cubs. That's the first answer. The second answer is yes, we can trust the bear completely. The bear has never been so trustworthy. The bear is begging to be part of us, to submerge his problems in us, to have his own bank account with us, to shop in our high street and be accepted as a dignified member of our forest as well as his. All the more so because his society and economy are in tatters, his natural resources are pillaged, and his managers incompetent beyond belief. The bear needs us so desperately that we may safely trust him to need us. The bear longs to wind back his dreadful history and emerge from the dark of the last 70 or 700 years. We are his daylight. The problem is we Westerners do not find it in us naturally to trust the bear, whether he's a white bear or a red bear or both kinds of bears at once, which is what he is at the moment. The bear may be in perdition without us, but there are lots of us who believe that's exactly where he belongs. Just as there were people in 1945 who argued that the defeated Germany should remain a rubble desert for the rest of human history. Smiley paused and seemed to wonder whether he had said enough. He glanced toward me, but I refused to catch his eye. The waiting silence must have convinced him to go on. The bear of the future will be whatever we make of him, and the reasons for making something of him are several. The first is common decency. When you've helped a man to escape from wrongful imprisonment, the last thing you need to do is provide him with a bowl of soup and the means to take his place in the free world. The second is so obvious it makes me a little intemperate to have to mention it at all. Russia, even Russia alone, shorn of all her conquests and possessions, is a vast country with a vast population in a crucial part of the globe. Do we leave the bear to rot, encourage him to become resentful, backward, an overarmed nation outside our camp, or make a partner of him in a world that's changing its shape every day? He picked up his balloon glass and peered thoughtfully into it while he swirled the last of his brandy. And I sensed that he was finding it harder to take his leave than he had expected. Yes, well, he muttered, as if somehow defending himself against his own assertions, it's not only our minds we're going to have to reconstruct either. It's the overmighty modern state we've built for ourselves as a bastion against something that isn't there anymore. We've given up far too many freedoms in order to be free. Now, we've got to take them back. He gave a shy grin, and I knew he was trying to break his own spell upon us. So, while you're out there striving loyally for the state, perhaps you'll do me a small favor and lean on its pillars from time to time. It's got a lot too big for its boots of late. It would be nice if you would cut it down to size. Ned, I'm aboard. Time you sent me home. He stood up abruptly as if shaking himself free of something that threatened to hold him too tight. Then, very deliberately, he treated himself to a last, slow look around the room. Not at the students anymore, but at the old photographs and trophies of his time, apparently committing them to memory. He was taking leave of his house after he had bequeathed it to its heirs. Then, with a great flurry, he launched a search for his spectacles before he discovered he was wearing them. Then he drew back his shoulders and marched purposefully to the door as two students hastened to open it for him. Yes, well, good night, and thanks. Oh, and tell them to spy on the ozone layer, will you? It's dreadfully hot in St. Agnes for the time of year. He left without looking back.
Our final reader this afternoon is the other co-organizer of this event, Roxana Robinson. She will be reading Virginia Woolf. Roxana Robinson has been coming to Cornwall, Connecticut all her life. She inherited her love for its flora and fauna from her grandfather, Samuel Scoville Jr. She came here only in the summers until 2007. That's when Roxana and her husband Tony took over their family's summer house and made it year-round. Now she helps out on the program committee at the library. She gave the Anna Karenina series in quarantine. She teaches at the MFA program at Hunter College, plays tennis, and is also a gardener, which, as someone has said, is a competitive sport in Cornwall. When she's not doing anything else, she writes. She's written 11 books and is a contributor to the New Yorker and the Cornish Chronicle. And we have Roxana to thank for the tradition of Cornwall reads Cornwall, and our variation today, Cornwall, Connecticut reads Cornwall, England. Welcome, Roxana.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to read something from Virginia Woolf. And Virginia Woolf, who is one of my favorite writers, was really the reason for this idea of Cornwall, Connecticut reads Cornwall, England, because Virginia Woolf is perhaps the best known writer connected to Cornwall. She was one of the great modernists who changed forever the way a novel was written, abandoning the conventional narrative style of the 19th century, in which plot was the driving force. Virginia Woolf and Marcel Proust and James Joyce employed what's now called stream of consciousness, in which the plot is provided by the meandering vagaries of the mind. Woolf's prose was close to poetry, and her style was lyrical and repetitive, suggesting a dreamlike state. She was an early and elegant feminist, questioning the relationship between women and the world in ways that were acute, often funny, and always unforgettable. To the Lighthouse, her masterpiece, was written in 1927, and it was based on Woolf's own experience at a family summer house in Cornwall. Her father was a distinguished scholar, but needy and self-absorbed. Her mother, famously both beautiful and compassionate. In the book, they are Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, hosts of a summer house party. A central theme of the book is a sailing expedition to the lighthouse. Also central is the story of Lily Briscoe, a young woman painter. Mrs. Ramsay, who has 8 children, urges Lily to marry, but Lily is determined to lead a solitary life devoted to her art. Woolf asks the question of how a woman should lead her life and how she should embrace her art. It is a beautiful, strange, mesmerizing book, thoughtful, wise, and continually surprising. This is the opening. Yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsay, but you'll have to be up with the lark, she added. To her son, these words conveyed an extraordinary joy, as if it were settled. The expedition were bound to take place, and the wonder to which he had looked forward for years and years, it seemed, was, after a night's darkness and a day's sail, within touch. Since he belonged, even at the age of 6, to that great clan which cannot keep this feeling from that, but must let future prospects with their joys and sorrows cloud what is actually at hand. Since to such people, even in earliest childhood, any turn in the wheel of sensation has the power to crystallize and transfix the moment upon which its gloom or radiance rests. James Ramsay, sitting on the floor, cutting out pictures from the illustrated catalog of the Army and Navy stores, endowed the picture of a refrigerator, as his mother spoke, with heavenly bliss. It was fringed with joy. The wheelbarrow, the lawnmower, the sound of poplar trees, leaves whitening before rain, rooks cawing, brooms knocking, dresses rustling, all these were so colored and distinguished in his mind that he had already his private code, his secret language. Though he appeared the image of stark and uncompromising severity, with his high forehead and his fierce black eyes, impeccably candid and pure, frowning slightly at the sight of human frailty, so that his mother, watching him guide his scissors neatly round the refrigerator, imagined him all in red and ermine on the judge's bench, or directing a stern and momentous enterprise in some crisis of public affairs. But, said his father, stopping in front of the drawing room window, it won't be fine. Had there been an axe handy, a poker, or any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him there and then, James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breasts by his mere presence, standing as now, lean as a knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically, not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought, but also with some secret conceit at his own judgment. What he said was true. It was always true. He was incapable of untruth. Never tampered with a fact, never altered a disagreeable word to suit the pleasure or convenience of any mortal being, least of all his own children, who, sprung from his loins, should be aware from childhood that life is difficult, facts uncompromising, and the passage to that fabled land where our brightest hopes are extinguished, our frail barks founder in darkness. Here Mr. Ramsay would straighten his back and narrow his little blue eyes upon the horizon, one that needs, above all, courage, truth, and the power to endure. So that's the opening of this novel, which is radical in many ways. It starts out with the answer to a question that we'd never hear asked. It starts out with a 6-year-old boy wanting to kill his father, 1928, that's radical. And it presents Mr. Ramsay as a very complicated father figure. And this is shortly thereafter. Mrs. Ramsay, who had been sitting loosely, folding her son in her arm, braced herself, and half turning, seemed to raise herself with an effort, and at once to pour erect into the air a rain of energy, a column of spray, looking at the same time animated and alive, as if all her energies were being fused into force, burning and illuminating. Quietly, though, she sat, taking up her stocking again, she's knitting, and into this fecundity, this fountain and spray of life, the fatal sterility of the male plunged itself like a beak of brass, barren and bare. He wanted sympathy. He was a failure, he said. Mrs. Ramsay flashed her needles. Mr. Ramsay repeated, never taking his eyes from her face, that he was a failure. She blew the words back at him, but he must have more than that. It was sympathy he wanted, to be assured of his genius, first of all, and then to be taken within the circle of life, warmed and soothed, to have his senses restored to him, his barrenness made fertile, and all the rooms of the house made full of life. The drawing room, behind the drawing room, the kitchen, above the kitchen, the bedrooms, and beyond them, the nurseries. They must all be furnished. They must be filled with life. So Virginia Woolf is talking about what a marriage means and how the husband, who is the man who is famous and distinguished within the world, is continually supported and given life by his wife, who creates the household, the kitchen, the dining room, the children. That's what sustains him, which was not the way the Victorians had seen successful men. This is a little further on. This is while Lily Briscoe is painting on the lawn, and another house guest, Mr. Banks, is next to her, and he has a sort of a very respectful passion for their hostess. He's a widower, and he gazes at his beautiful hostess with respectful adoration. So now we're in Lily Briscoe's mind. That Mr. Banks should feel this for Mrs. Ramsay, she glanced at him musing, was helpful, was exalting. She wiped one brush after another upon a piece of old rag, menially, on purpose. She took shelter from the reverence which covered all women. She felt herself praised. Let him gaze. She would steal a look at her picture. She could have wept. It was bad. It was bad. It was infinitely bad. She could have done it differently, of course. The color could have been thinned and faded, the shapes etherealized. That was how another Cornwall painter would have seen it. But then she did not see it like that. She saw the color burning on a framework of steel, the light of a butterfly's wing lying upon the arches of a cathedral. Of all that, only a few random marks scrawled upon the canvas remained. And it would never be seen, never be hung even. And there was Mr. Tansley, whispering in her ear, "Women can't paint. Women can't write." Mr. Tansley's another house guest. One of the things that Virginia Woolf did was to question the way men's activities and interests took precedence over women's in the public discourse. So she says, why is it that war and sports are given so much attention, but what women do is given little attention? And in this book, she celebrates Mrs. Ramsay as the sort of queen of the household and celebrates the importance of that role. And in this book, instead of the Battle of Borodino, we are given a gathering at the dinner table. And this is in the middle of that dinner with all the 8 children and the house guests at the table and the Ramsays. Now, 8 candles were stood down the table, and after the first stoop, the flames stood upright and drew with them into visibility the long table entire, and in the middle, a yellow and purple dish of fruit. What had her daughter done with it, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, for Rose's arrangement of the grapes and pears, of the horny pink-lined shell, made her think of a trophy fetched from the bottom of the sea, of Neptune's banquet, of the bunch that hangs with vine leaves over the shoulder of Bacchus in some picture, among the leopard skins and the torches lolloping red and gold. Now all the candles were lit, and the faces on both sides of the table were brought nearer by the candlelight, and composed as they had not been in the twilight, into a party round a table. For the night was now shut off by panes of glass, which, far from giving any accurate view of the outside world, rippled it so strangely that here, inside the room, seemed to be order and dry land. There, outside, a reflection in which things waved and vanished waterily. It's a word she made up. Some change at once went through them all, as if this had really happened, and they were all conscious of making a party together in a hollow, on an island, had their common cause against that fluidity out there. And this is the last, this is 10 years later. The house party is repeated, though Mrs. Ramsay is no longer running the household. She has died. So the third part is about people's lives without Mrs. Ramsay. Lily Briscoe is working on her painting again. Life is a work of art, she repeated, looking from her canvas to the drawing room steps and back again. She must rest for a moment. And resting, looking from one to the other vaguely, the old question which traversed the sky of the soul perpetually, the vast, the general question, which was apt to particularize itself at such moments as these. When she released faculties that had been on the strain, stood over her, paused over her, darkened over her. What is the meaning of life? That was all, a simple question, one that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one. This, that, and the other, herself and Charles Tansley and the breaking wave at the beach, Mrs. Ramsay bringing them together, Mrs. Ramsay saying, "Life stands still here." Mrs. Ramsay making of the moment something permanent, as in another sphere, Lily herself tried to make of the moment something permanent. This was the nature of a revelation. In the midst of chaos, there was shape. This eternal passing and flowing. She looked at the clouds going and the leaves shaking, was struck into stability. Life stands still here, Mrs. Ramsay said. Mrs. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay, Lily repeated. She owed it all to her. Thank you.
I loved all of those passages from each of the writers. Thank you to our readers today. We're going to have a reception, as I mentioned, over at the library. I hope you will all join us. And I want to say a couple of words of thanks before we head over. So we want to thank Margaret Haskey, who is always wrangling and planning all the library events. To Becky Robert, who planned and organized the reception and put out all the chairs today. Thank you so much. To Ben Lesh, who is assisting with the sound and will be posting a video of this event online shortly. And to my husband, Guy Story, who's actually recording the event today, so thank you. Of course, to Jane Garmey and Roxana Robinson for selecting the readers and the passages and organizing pretty much this whole thing, including asking me, and for which I am eternally grateful. It has been so fun to do this. So thanks to all of you for coming. I hope you will join us at the reception, and I hope you'll come back next year when we once again celebrate Cornwall Reads Cornwall. Thank you.